have done here is that this is the image div, and we refer this container as the image div. So inside this image div, I say set attribute draggable to 2. The moment I do that, let's try to inspect and see what happens. If I inspect on this particular image, now you can see this is the default div that we have hard-coded in the HTML. It already has draggable equal to true. Now, if I add one more div, click me, then you can see one more div got added and it already has the draggable true property. So every div now we are going to add will be having a draggable true property. Let's add one more. You can see one more got added on the go, and this has the draggable true property, right? So with this particular function, set attribute, we are able to actually set a particular attribute altogether. So this function is available on HTML elements to set a particular attribute with a value. It takes two arguments. First one is attribute name. Second one is attribute value. Okay, attribute value. So this is how you can actually put it in place. Okay, so you can add set attribute draggable to true, and things will start becoming draggable. Okay, this looks fairly nice. This looks fairly good. Okay, let's see what are the rest of the things that we have. So you can see now we have draggable items. Now what do we need to do is we need to take them and drag them inside this tier list item div. So let me create a tier list. Let's say strongest Avenger. Click me. Okay, so this is the tier list, right? If I inspect and if I just close it here, then you can see this is the tier list, right? Inside this tier list, we have an h1 and we have a div tier list items, which is as of now empty. What we have to do is we have to take these draggable items and bring them inside the tier list items altogether, right? Okay. Now, as I mentioned, that draggable is nothing but an event. So probably we can listen to these events as well, right? We can technically listen to these events as well. Okay. So let's start doing that. Okay. So let's put it in. Okay. Cool. So we can use this set attribute function to set these draggable values. Okay, set these draggable values. Okay, now what do you think is going to be dragged? This div is going to be dragged. Can I say that? So if we have to add an event listener, we need to add that event listener on this div. Can I say that? So the div with class item container will be dragged. So we need to add an event listener to this div. Can I say that? Because this is the div that is expected to be dragged. So we need to add an event listener on this particular div. Okay. If we have to add an event listener on this particular div, we need to select this element as well. If we want to add an event listener to these divs, we need to select them as well. Can I say that? We need to first of all select them, then only we can call add event listener. Can I say that? We need to first of all select them, then only we will be able to call add event listener, right? Okay. But if you carefully see, for selection or targeting the elements, I have only taught you one function, get element by ID. But just think about it. There are going to be a lot of divs with the class item container, because all the images are going to be inside this container, and there can be like 30, 40 odd images that you want to tier. So we cannot give each and every one of them a unique ID. So technically, if you carefully see, if there are 30 divs, all those 30 divs of item container class needs to have the same event handler, because all of them are going to be handled in the same way, right? Just think about it. Let's say if I just refresh, if I copy paste this div 3 times, copy pasted 3 times. You can see there are 3 Captain America images. Now all these 3 Captain America images needs to be handled in the same way. So I need to select all of them, but I cannot give all of them a unique ID, right? Because let's say there are 400 elements. I cannot give 400 IDs altogether. So how do we select more than one element? We select more than one element using class. And that's where one more type of a selector comes into the picture. As all of them have got a common class, and we need to attach an event listener to all of these divs, we can use get elements by class name function. Okay, so there's a new function. Document dot get elements by class name. And you can see these functions are so, I would say, appropriate with their namings, because more than one element has the same class name. So here they say get elements. By class name. Whereas ID is for a unique element, so it says get element by ID, right? So you can see get elements by class name. This function takes the name of the class we want to select and then return us an array of all those elements which have got the same class. As simple as that. Okay, so let me show you. So if I go and inspect console, if I say document dot get elements by class name, and the class name is item container, can you see we are getting kind of like 3 elements? Item container 1, item container 2, item container 3. How cool is that? Right? We can actually get all of these elements all together. Right? That's the most interesting part. So let's use it. Okay. For now, I'm keeping these dummy divs. Later I will remove it. Okay. I'll come to my script tag, and here I will say const item containers is equals to. You can see I'm properly naming the variables as well. Item containers. Document dot get elements by class name item container. So this is going to give me all the item containers inside an array. And if I have all the item containers inside an array, I can iterate on that array. I can technically iterate on that array. So I can say item containers dot, we can say for each, dot for each. Okay. And I will write a new function. I will write a new function. Let me write a function maybe at the very bottom. Just a second. I'll write a new function. Set up item container for drag. Set up item container for drag. This is the method that I will call on each of the item container. Okay. On each of the item container, I'm going to call this particular method. Okay. This method will take one item container because it's a for each. And I can say item container dot add event listener. Now there are a lot of drag based events. One of the event is drag start. What is this drag start event? The drag start event is fired when the user starts dragging an element or a text selection. Okay. So when you start dragging something, that's when this drag start function will be executed. Okay. And I'll just put a simple callback saying console.log started dragging. Okay. Let's see if this works or not. So I'll take this Captain America image and I start dragging. Okay. Let's see, this doesn't console.log. Let's quickly check. Let's first of all quickly do a console.log on item container. Okay. Save it. Oh, it says for each is not a function. Just a second. My bad. Okay. So now you can interestingly see something is happening. That there's no for each method coming up. Why there is no for each method coming up? There's an interesting reason for that. If I say x is equals to this, is x a normal array? Is this x a normal array? No. Can you see this is a new type of a, I would say, element, which is HTML collection. On this HTML collection, if you see, there is no for each method. If I do x dot, there is no for each method coming up. Can I say that? There is no for each method coming up. Now that's a problem. Right? So these kind of list is called as HTML collection or node list. HTML collection, and you can see for each. Now, how do you loop over this? You can use a for of loop. Or there is one more thing that you can do that I will tell you later. But let's try it out with the first of all the for of loop. So we'll not use for each. And we say for const item container of item containers. I will say, let's call set up item container for drag. And now can you see we are getting these item containers all together. Let's see if now dragging works or not. If I start dragging, you can see it's printed started dragging. For each of them, it is printing started dragging the moment I start dragging it. Okay. So what happened was, because this is not a normal array that it returns, so for each method is not present. If you want to iterate on this array, you have to use the for of loop. If you want to use for each, there is one more method that I will later introduce. But for now, this works for us, right? That we are able to catch the dragging method. Okay. So let's talk about it. This method returns us an HTML collection list. So normal array functions are not going to work on it. And we need to iterate on all the elements of this list and set up event listeners. So we can use the for of loop. Okay. And we can do something like this. So we'll take the for of loops from here, take the item containers. Okay. And then we will write this function, set up item container. There we go. Right. This should be done. And we don't need this. Okay. So this is what we are going to do. We are going to set up the item containers like this. Okay. So in HTML elements, we have an event called as drag start, which is fired when we start dragging an element. Okay, so you can see we have added an event listener for drag start altogether. Okay, this is something that we have to keep in mind. Again repeating. The get elements by class name function does not return you a normal array on which you can do just for each or map or reduce or filter these kind of functions. It returns you a special list called as an HTML collection list. And on that object, we do not have the for each method and everything. So to iterate on that list, you have to use a traditional for of loop. And inside the for of loop, what we are going to do is we are going to go to each individual item container. This is one item container. And call the method setup container drag. Inside this setup container drag method, we take the item container, and on this item container, we add an event listener for drag start. That what should happen when somebody starts dragging our element. This is something that we are going to add. Okay, cool. Now, you might be thinking, what to do when someone starts dragging an item? We can store the item being dragged. In a variable so that we can keep a track of it. Okay, so when somebody starts dragging an item, what do we want to do? We want to store that item in a variable so that we can keep a track of it. So what I'll do is I'll make a variable, let current dragged item. Okay, initially it is going to be undefined. And we are going to say whenever the drag starts, we will say current dragged item is equals to, now because this is an event listener, so we have the event object here, and we can say event dot target. Okay, so you can see what's happening here. What's happening here? The moment I start dragging an element, I store that element inside the current dragged item variable, which is kind of like a global variable that we have made. And how do we store that element? Because this is an event listener, it has access to the event object, and on every event object we have a .target method which tells on which particular element this event is technically happening. Okay, we can even console.log event.target. If I do event.target, save it, and if I start dragging, can you see this is giving us the corresponding image? But there is one problem. There is one problem. We are getting the image. We are getting the image which is being dragged. I don't want the image. I want the div. I want the corresponding div. So when you select the element, this image is being selected, but I don't want this image. I want this particular div. Now, why is that happening? So later I will talk about the concept of event bubbling and event propagation and event delegation, right? But before that, you can assume the fact that here we are with our cursor, we are selecting the image. We are selecting the image. That's why the element on which the I would say event listener is present is the corresponding image. If you want to get the div, you can access the parent of the image. Get the parent of an element in JavaScript. How do you get the parent? You can see there is a parent element property. You can see dot parent node. These kind of properties are there. You can see parent element properties. There are a lot of properties using which you can get the parent. So let me show you. For example, if you print the whole event object, I start dragging. You can see this is the drag event. On this drag event, you have the target, which is the image. On this image, if you scroll down, you will be having a property for parent. Let's go up. You can see we have access to the parent node. We have access to the corresponding parent node altogether, right? So let's use this. Let's use this. So we can say event.target.parent node. And now if I print event.target.parent node, save it. If I start dragging, you can see now we are getting the div. Now we are getting the corresponding div, right? Okay. So there is one small concept that is going on behind the scenes here. That if you apply an event listener on the parent, those event listeners are accessible on the children as well. How is that accessible? I'll talk about, as I mentioned, the concept of event bubbling and event delegation, event propagation. That's going to come up later. But for now, you can understand that because this is a wrapper div, I'm selecting the image. So this image also has the access to the drag event. But we do not want the access to the image. We want access to the parent of the image. That is this div. So how do you get access to the parent of any element? You can call the dot parent node property in order to get access to the parent. So let's start talking about it. So because when we start dragging, we will be putting the cursor on an image. We need to also get parent of the image. And to get parent of any HTML element, we can use the parent node property. Parent node property. Okay. So how the code looks like? We are going to create a dragged item. Then there's going to be more code in between. And then we are going to put this event listener altogether. Okay. And here we should say, let's get the event. And I'll say current dragged item is equals to event.target.parent node. How cool is that? So we are now able to get which element is being dragged, and we are able to store that in a global variable altogether. This is something that we have technically achieved. How many of you guys are able to get this point? Time for questions. I would like to pause myself here and see if you guys have any questions.